welcome. I'm Andrea Zaya, the Interim Executive Director here at the National Museum of Industrial History, and I am thrilled to see all of you here today for Steel Weekend. This is our annual event that we host here on the former Bethlehem plant site. We are having a very special focus this year. We've been delving into mining and coking processes, so essential to the primary end of the steelmaking process. So many of you know of the various plants, the shipyards, the railroads owned by Bethlehem Steel internationally. But few of you might know, well, you might not also know about the quarries and the coal and the iron ore and the manganese mines worldwide that were once owned as well. But we're gonna learn a little bit more about that operation here in Latin America today. So it's an honor for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Cory Fischer Hoffman. She's an interdisciplinary scholar, media maker, oral historian, and visiting assistant professor in Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Lafayette College. She's currently writing a book about the Bethlehem Steel Corporation's century-long history of mining operations in Latin America. Her research has received support from the Mining History Association, the Hagley Museum and Archives, and as a Fulbright scholar for her recent work in Brazil. She'll be telling us a little bit more about that work today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Fischer.
Hi everybody, it's so nice to be here with you all today. Thanks for coming out on this gorgeous Sunday, and thank you so much to Andrea and to Megan and to Emily and to Jill and so many people who have supported this work, so I really appreciate you all being here. Actually, I'm going to start here. So in many ways, my story starts right here in this museum. I moved to the Lehigh Valley in 2016 to take a postdoctoral fellowship at Lehigh University. And in my first few months of living here, this museum opened and I attended the opening ceremony. And when I walked through the museum, I found myself at this table. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. And it's over back here in the back, so you can check it out afterwards. But I found myself just pressing all the buttons and allowing the colors to light up. And there's one button you can press and raw materials lights up around the globe. And so I'm looking at all of these places around the globe and thinking, wow, how did they move thousands and thousands, really millions of tons of earth from these distant places to make steel? So this opened up a lot of questions, and I was particularly interested in Latin America, and that is where my interest in this project originated from. So as I started to ask these questions about mining and extraction and starting to read more on those who have written about mining and extraction, I found this really fascinating book written by Arboleda, in which he talks a lot about seeing cities as upside down mines. So in other words, everything that we can see that is built came from somewhere in the ground. And starting to think a little bit more about the relationships between those things that are built and the earth from which they came. So when we think about these relationships between material structures and the earth from which they came, we think a lot here about, especially for many of you in the room who know so much about Bethlehem Steel's history, we think a lot about the big structures, the famous structures like the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building. But as we think about these huge material structures and buildings, it raises this question of, well, where did the raw materials come from to actually build these structures? And this was a part of the story that I was interested in investigating. And as I started to dig deeper, I realized that that story exists in very piecemeal ways, largely written in Spanish and Portuguese for the mine sites in Latin America, and it's not very well documented in English. And so as I started to do this research, I asked a number of questions, as you can see here. So one question is, thinking about cities as upside down mines or thinking about these structures as inverted, what's the upside down history of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation? Or how do we understand where these raw materials come from? And as I asked this question, I focused primarily on Latin America. And as many of you know, Bethlehem Steel had mines that extended around the world, including Liberia and Canada, and many mines in the United States as well. However, I decided to focus on Latin America for two main reasons. One, because I have a degree in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and it's where I spent my career focusing my academic work. and also because Latin America has a long history of extraction. So for those of you who follow the history of Latin America, so much of colonial relationship leading into the present day has to do with mining and extraction. So it led me to ask these bigger questions about Bethlehem steel in Latin America. And so thinking about this, I took off on a research project. And this led me first to go to Chile in 2011. I was able to, 2021. I was able to do that right before the pandemic hit and put a stall to a lot of more international travel for a while. And then with support from a Fulbright grant, I was able to go to Brazil this past year, which was a really fascinating experience, and I'll share more about that. I've also conducted over 40 interviews, and there might be people in this room who have things to contribute to this story that I haven't spoken to yet. So I'm still doing interviews, and if you have any interest or a connection to this history, I'd love to speak with you afterwards. In many of the interviews that I did with former workers as well as residents of a lot of the company towns and mining sites throughout Latin America, a part of the work was really listening to people's stories about everyday lives in these mining towns, but also trying to create a big structural picture of these operations at a large global scale. So that really sent me into the archives to try to understand the historical record of moving millions of tons of earth from distant places. So a lot of the images on the back here are some of the archives that I was able to visit, and this is me in Brazil next to a huge chunk of manganese right there. So that's the mineral that I was looking at, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the basic overview of operations for Bethlehem Steel break down into two main categories. The Bethlehem Steel Corporation had vertically integrated, which means wholly owned subsidiary operations in iron ore mining in 3 countries in Latin America over the history of the corporation. So that is Cuba, Chile, and Venezuela. And then they also had joint subsidiary operations, so operations in which they partnered with national corporations to do manganese mining, and that was both in Brazil and Mexico. And so as you look, I'm just gonna turn this so I can see a little more. So as you look at the timeline here, you can see that this really spans a century. So from 1884 to 1984 is the period of which I'm looking at in terms of my research. And that really overlaps pretty nicely, historically speaking, with what many historians think of as the golden age of US capitalism, right? So this is a really important historical time period. And in looking into all of these operations, I'm able to make some connections between them. So as we learn about manganese in Brazil, we'll hear a little bit more. As we have questions and answers, I'm happy to speak about Brazil, but if you have questions about any of these places or operations, I'm happy to speak to those as well. So starting off, manganese is a mineral that's really essential in steel making. It is found in the Earth's crust. It's far more rare than iron ore, for example. And for it to be economical to mine it, there needs to be deposits of high-grade manganese ore. The grade of that has changed over time, but roughly more than 50% of the rock needs to be pure manganese, this mineral mixed in with other minerals. So during the early developments of the Bessemer process of steel production, it was discovered pretty early on that manganese was an essential mineral in steel making because it played a neutralizing element in the blast furnace. In other words, it helped prevent explosions, and it also made the steel come out much more uniform in nature. So some people refer to it as sort of the starch in the steel, as this way of holding it together. So while manganese has always been required in much smaller quantities than iron ore for steel production, it's always been irreplaceable. It's an essential raw material. Although there's been experiments to try to find replacements, none have ever been found. So roughly, while steelmaking processes can vary across time, it takes 1.6 tons of iron ore to make a ton of steel, whereas it only requires about 40 pounds of manganese to produce a ton of steel. So we're talking about much smaller quantities required than iron ore. In the United States, small amounts of manganese did exist. However, by the end of the 1900s, they had largely been depleted in the United States, and this was mostly in Appalachia. And so what this meant is that the US steel industry
heavily relied on imported minerals for steel production starting off early in the 20th century. And following the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Soviet Union ended up being one of the major exporters of manganese to the United States, and really one of the most important sources of manganese. So there's some important history here in terms of why mining began in this particular time period for Bethlehem Steel that I want to talk about. And I'm just going to figure out a way to do this so I can also look. So in 1943, after various periods of shortages of having manganese, so there were certain periods in time in which the imports of manganese to the United States had been cut off. And as a result, the steel industry, as well as members of the intelligence and defense community, had been particularly concerned with these manganese shortages and what they meant, not only for steel production, but specifically for weapons production in the United States. And so in 1943, because of World War II, exports from the Soviet Union had been temporarily cut off. And this created a panic among US steel producers and defense circles who were highly concerned about access to what they were designating as a quote-unquote strategic mineral. So the strategic mineral meaning a mineral that was required in weapon and industrial production, however, that did not exist in large extractable quantities in the United States. So this really came to a head, and we can evidence this kind of panic in a number of intelligence reports that were written in this time period. And I'll quote from some of these reports throughout the talk, but many declassified CIA documents attest to really panic in the United States defense circles about how they were going to access manganese. This really came to a head with a full-on embargo in 1949, when the Soviet Union, who was the largest exporter of manganese to the United States, just put a full-on embargo. So they said, we are going to keep our manganese that came from the mines in Georgia, we're going to divert it to our own steel industry, and we are no longer going to supply the United States with manganese. So it was on the heels of this embargo that at the government level, the United States passed the Defense Materials Procurement Act in 1950. And the Defense Materials Procurement Act set up a system for stockpiling strategic minerals and created a series of government agencies to oversee purchasing as well as to aid in financing the production of these strategic minerals. So while chrome and nickel were also a part of these conversations, manganese was viewed as the most important strategic mineral in this time period. So as the image behind me attests, this is a Bethlehem Steel shell case factory picture from 1918. Bethlehem Steel Corporation had a particularly unique relationship with the US government. So not only was Bethlehem Steel a big corporation, and you can imagine that it had close ties to government, but they were also an arms producer. So they were really at the heart of some of these conversations about having access to manganese. Furthermore, something that I think is important to bring up about Bethlehem Steel's history is that they were also a pioneer in importing minerals. This is something that sort of changed their competitive edge over a long period. Sometimes it was beneficial, sometimes it was less beneficial. But the company was really an early importer of minerals. So 1884 in Cuba, we're talking about Cuba under Spanish colonial rule. This is before the Panama Canal. This is before the United States has really asserted itself as this global power, and Bethlehem Steel is already operating as a transnational mining corporation in the late 1800s. So they were a real pioneer and stood out among US steel producers in terms of early importers of minerals. Okay, so stick with me here. So this graph behind me, comes from an article that's cited below, and it is in Spanish, so just as a heads up, I didn't reproduce it in English. But what this is showing is it's showing imports, different countries' production and imports to the United States. And so a lot of what this shows is that Cuba was relied on heavily as an exporter during World War II to really fill in this gap after the Soviet Union had cut off its supplies. And we see in this time period a rise of imports from South Africa, India, and Ghana. But according to all of the intelligence briefings that I've read, members of the US government believed that these could only be temporary sources. And the reason why is that, first of all, they were located much more close to Europe, and they were also places that were seen within Europe's sphere of influence. And so in this sense, while the European steel industry had largely been destroyed during World War II, there was anticipation of it being rebuilt and of these sources of manganese going back to Europe and not to the United States. So as a result, again, these intelligence briefings attest to concern in the United States and interest in having manganese operations in Latin America, that really the United States could operate as its sphere of influence, and that we're also geographically closer to the United States. So you'll note that as a country, Brazil had been exporting manganese to the United States since early in the 20th century. One of the operations, the one that's called at Conselheiro de Lafayette, was actually operated through a partnership with US Steel. So US Steel had early interests in this mine in Minas Gerais. So despite the graph being in Spanish, I hope that you can see, and I will use the laser pointer, but this dotted line right here indicates, and this is Brazil, that's the dotted line, but this indicates when the mine at Serra de Navio, which is the mine that Bethlehem Steel invested in, went online. And so what you really see here is that in many ways, the mine in Brazil that Bethlehem Steel invested in resolved this issue of shortages of manganese following the 1950 Defense Materials Procurement Act. Okay, so that gives us a bit of context about what was happening in the United States. Let's look at Brazil for a moment. Okay, so Amapá, which is located, which you see an image of behind me, is located in the northern tip of Brazil. So this region borders French Guiana and Suriname. It sits at the point where the Amazon River meets the Atlantic Ocean. And as a gateway to the Amazon, the Portuguese created a fort there in the early 1700s in Macapá. And largely at that port, this was meant to guard a territory that was understood to be rich in natural resources, specifically gold and rubber. And so a fight over natural resources among colonial powers led to really hundreds of years of border disputes. And so as these colonial powers were fighting for who had access to this resource-rich region of the Amazon, there were also neutral zones created between rivers where, let's say, the French were on one side and the Portuguese were on the other. And along these neutral zones, they became areas in which African and indigenous communities that were fleeing forced labor went to form their own communities. And in Portuguese, we might call them in English maroon communities, and in Portuguese, they're referred to as quilombos. And these quilombos were very close, were set up in the areas of Amapá, very close to where the manganese was discovered. And while you see roads on the map behind me, 100 years ago, none of these roads existed, and the transport system was largely through river systems and through boats. So as one of the sort of stories goes about the discovery of manganese in Amapá, there was a merchant trader who traveled the river systems selling commodities and dry goods to gold miners and folks who were living in the forests. And as he traveled up the river and heading into an area close to where manganese was discovered, as the story goes, he was pointed out a heavy black rock that he assumed to be iron ore. And he took that heavy black rock and he put it in his boat, and he used it as a ballast to weigh down his boat. And so he had that for many years. Coincidentally, the same period at which this happened, and so this is someone by the name of Mario Cruz that's mentioned up here. So coincidentally, the same year that this happened, in 1934, is when the president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, announces that Brazil is going to build a national steel industry. And this is a part of a much larger policy push towards industrialization in the country. So not unrelated, in 1943, the region of Amapá is declared as a federal territory. And that federal territory meant that it seceded from the state of Pará. It was its own entity, but it was controlled by the federal government. And so the federal government appointed a captain by the name of Jean-Marie to rule this region of Amapá, this newly created federal territory. And just to be clear about sort of the population and size of this, at that point in 1944, the population of Amapá was 2,647 people total. So that is about the same number of students that attend Liberty High School right now. So in the entire region of Amapá. So Jean-Marie comes to power and he's charged by the Brazilian federal government to examine the possible means of economic development in the region. He's challenged and told he should explore mineral wealth and certainly bring a push for industry in the Amazon. So Jean-Marie responds to this call by inviting citizens to collaborate in a process where they tell him if any mineral sources are found. And as a result of this, Mario Cruz takes this big rock that he'd had in his boat for almost 10 years, and he sends a sample to the governor, who sends it on for laboratory testing. In 1946, the sample was confirmed to be high-grade manganese ore. And so various companies get very interested in this region in Brazil, and they're awarded exploration rights. And that includes Hanna Mining Company from Cleveland, Ohio, as well as US Steel out of Pittsburgh. They send personnel and equipment down, geologists, and they begin surveying the land. So just a quick pause here to note that there's a Brazilian scholar, I'll grab his book. There's a Brazilian scholar, Adalberto Paz, that analyzes why the story of Mario Cruz is so widely celebrated in the lore around manganese and Amapá. And he argues that Cruz represented the everyday man. He was a local caboclo, which is a way of saying somebody of mixed race, who was working in partnership with the government for the goal of development. And that this was a really convenient narrative for the government in this moment to say, we, the government, we partner with the everyday man to fight for progress. And so Mario Cruz is widely memorialized. Most people in Amapá have heard his name. And so this story is told over and over again about the discovery of manganese in the region. And yet, there's also many other documented histories of discovery. For example, there was a gold miner, a black man who was from Barbados, who found the dense rock when he was digging a grave for his wife, Teresinha. And so that local gravesite still exists today. It's extremely close to where the manganese mine that Bethlehem Steel ultimately operated was located. But the story of a black foreigner discovering manganese was far less convenient for the federal government at that time. And so Mario Cruz was sort of memorialized, and the narrative about him continues. So with the exploration rights awarded to foreign mining companies, there was some pushback from Brazilian nationals who didn't want to see the Amazon's natural resources fall into foreign hands. And they particularly did not want to see the disastrous example created by Henry Ford 50 years earlier through the failed rubber plantation in the Amazon jungle repeat itself. And if you have never heard that history, there's a fantastic book called Fordlandia by Greg Grandin. I highly recommend. So what happens is that Jean-Marie, who's the governor, ends up meeting up with his good friend in Rio de Janeiro, who's a lawyer. And his good friend, who's a lawyer, says, hey, you know what? My brother is a mining engineer, and he's got this mining operation in Minas Gerais. And I think instead of handing over our mineral rights to foreign corporations, we should make sure that it stays in the hands of Brazilian nationals. So I'm gonna make sure my brother gets a proposal into you. So sure enough, his brother gets in a proposal. So Cory then purchased the equipment that US Steel and Hanna Mining Company had used to survey the land, and they began to plan for a scale of mining that they had never experienced prior in the region, and in reality, which Cory itself was completely unfamiliar with. We're talking 96% of Amapá is rainforest, right? So thinking about starting an operation there involves many components. So while this could have been considered very good news for Cory that they got this contract, pretty soon into their examination, they realized it was simply going to be impossible to open up an industrial scale mine at the size envisioned with literally all of the capital in Brazil. They were going to need to have foreign investors. So even with government funding, it wasn't going to be possible. And in addition to needing financing, Antunes was out of his technical depth. He was actually a civil engineer who had been trained to work on railroads, and his first job was actually working on the railroads of manganese mines in Minas Gerais. He took a gamble, gathered up some capital from doctors that he knew in Minas Gerais, and he bought his first rights to mining just as the Brazilian steel industry was launched. He anticipated a need and a demand for minerals, so he really made this smart business investment, but he had never operated a mine at this scale, and most of the mining operations in Minas Gerais that he was running were still bringing minerals down with donkeys. So the thought of this kind of industrial scale was beyond what he was ready to do. So this meant that Antunes needed to find investors and needed to find not only investors with capital, but also with technical know-how, a partner that could finance the project, so he traveled to the United States. He first met with US Steel and Hanna Mining Company, thinking that they were very familiar with the land and might be natural partners. Both of them turned down the offer because, of course, what Antunes was offering was that the foreign corporation could only have 49% interest, so not a majority controlling interest, but a minority controlling interest in the mine. So both of these corporations turned him down, and there's a story about Antunes that I was told many times, and it's been inflated by many different people, so we can take what we want from it. But something that I heard in Amapá, various versions, is that as Antunes was visiting these different corporations, most of the stories were him meeting with the president of a steel company, but I have to say a few people told me the story that he was meeting with the president of the United States. So this was, just a sense of how important this meeting was. And so as the story goes, the president, either from a steel company or the United States, likely a steel company, said, well, Mr. Antunes, how can you start a mine at this scale when you don't have the capital to do so? And so Antunes responded by saying, well, you may have the capital, we have the manganese. So we can see why he's sort of evolved as a bit of a folk hero among many Brazilians for standing up to US corporations and really advocating for a way to collaborate. So Antunes was clear in his own writing about this process that in addition to capital, he was looking for technical support. And interestingly, know-how was used in English, not translated into Portuguese in all of this. So it started to be like, we're looking for capital and quote unquote know-how. And so what happened is that Bethlehem Steel, upon meeting with Antunes, agrees to collaborate. And I'll get into that more in a moment. So Robert Butler, who's a Portuguese-speaking American prospector who was already living and working in Brazil at the time, was recruited by Bethlehem Steel to explore the site. At this point in 1949, the population of the entire territory of Amapá was 8,141 people. So that's just a little bit more than the student population at Lehigh University right now. So what's really remarkable is that this early team was documenting everything that they did. They were recording their observations about wildlife, about terrain, weather. They were making notes about the geography, about the political situation in the country, about access to materials and transportation. And they were making recommendations for how to build a mining operation and a town and train tracks in the middle of the jungle. But what's even more remarkable about this is that they wrote that all down in a logbook that is here at the National Museum of Industrial History, and I've had the pleasure of reading all of it. So in reading this document, something that really stood out to me was on the very first page. So following a long-awaited meeting with Jean-Henri, this team meets with Jean-Henri with Butler writes, and I quote, "We would have not have operational difficulties in Amapá as there are no unions and no politicians in the territory." So we can see very clearly what they were looking for in terms of the conditions for operating a mine. So this is not the only story of manganese in Brazil. Amapá was not the only source in this time period, and other sources were being explored at the time. So US Steel was actually working on the border near Bolivia at a deposit known as Urucum, and that is in this area. And they also had the mines at Conselheiro de Lafayette in this part of Minas Gerais. and they were the longest standing source of manganese in the country, but a lot of the highest quality ore had already been depleted by this time period. And through reading through these intelligence documents, it's also very interesting to see what the United States, specifically the CIA in this case, was looking for. And they were particularly nervous about the proximity between this site in Minas Gerais and the steel centers, which were located here in the southern part of the country. And the fear in this time period we're talking about, the 1950s, was that of nationalization of the mines. And so as a result, it was clear that the mines up in Amapá offered a strategic example because they were so distant from the Brazilian steel industry that the thought that the Brazilian state would take over the mining operations to incorporate them into their own steel industry seemed less of a risk. Ultimately, the mine site at Urucum didn't work out. There's a much longer and complicated history, but essentially US Steel was offered less favorable terms than Bethlehem Steel was offered in Amapá. So US Steel eventually pulled out, and they ended up going to Gabon, and they started a manganese mine there instead. So as these intelligence reports note, while comparing all of these sources, the deposits in Amapá were described as the most promising Brazilian manganese deposits. So an initial deal was struck on June 9th, 1949 between Antunes and Bethlehem Steel. Arthur B. Homer, who was the president of Bethlehem Steel at the time, wrote in a 1950 letter referring to this novel arrangement in which, again, Bethlehem Steel took a 49% interest, so this huge multinational corporation, to essentially a Brazilian mining firm that had less than a decade's worth of experience, owning the 51% of the operation. And the letter, which I only have translated into Portuguese, and I've never found the original English letter, so I'm going to say some of these things because I know some of you know this stuff. So if you know, if anyone has any ideas where that original English language letter is, please let me know. So Arthur Homer says that, to our knowledge, this type of arrangement has never been made before. And I point that out because I think a part of this history is really understanding how Bethlehem Steel navigated as a multinational corporation, setting up these international mining operations in a political context of growing what some people refer to as resource nationalism, meaning many countries in Latin America, after literally centuries-long history of mining and extraction, many of which those minerals were taken to other countries and didn't necessarily benefit the people in Latin America, are raising questions at the highest levels of government about whether they want to allow foreign corporations to continue to do this. So, I also want to just pause and say that I read somewhere very early on, and I've lost this source, so I'm also telling a good audience who maybe can help me find it, that Bethlehem Steel had received significant pressure from the United States government to sign this deal. That they too were originally going to walk away, but that the US government said, we need this manganese, you must sign this deal. So if anyone knows about that source, talk to me too. Okay, so not that a joint venture had never been done before, but this kind of dynamic in which a Brazilian company held the majority share, Bethlehem Steel was a minority interest, was a new model that developed in this time period, and one that's been written about a lot in sort of business history. And it's been written about because it was understood as a new emerging model to fight nationalization. And so we can see that, well, I guess we'll get to that in a moment. So we can see that in many places. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the terms of the agreement. So first of all, Bethlehem Steel and Ikomi agreed to a 50-year concession for the mine. Amapá, the territory, would receive 4% royalties. They agreed to a minimum export quota of 500,000 tons of manganese annually. A train would need to be constructed from the mine site to the port in Santana on the Amazon River. And that company towns would be constructed both in Serra do Navio and then also near the port town in Santana. And the company itself would be responsible for electricity in both places. A rail line would be constructed, and that rail line would also have passenger cars and allow for other types of cargo to move between deep in the jungle and the port at the Amazon. And a somewhat shocking agreement that comes into it is that 20% of the profits would have to be reinvested into the territory of Amapá. So this is something that is sort of widely debated and interesting to talk about, and we can get into that more as well. Okay, so how is this financed? With Bethlehem Steel, while they signed on as a partner, the project received loans from both the World Bank and an agency called the Exim Bank, which operates under the US Treasury Department. So the rivalry between these two funding institutions is documented in the book by Tyler Priest that's behind me called Global Gambits, Big Steel, and the US Quest for Manganese. So it talks a lot about the inter-organizational rivalries in this time period. But to summarize it quickly, basically the World Bank offered a loan for less money that would have had to have been administered through the Brazilian government, whereas Exim Bank offered more money with more favorable terms, less red tape, and little involvement of the Brazilian government. So you can imagine which one they opted for. So they chose to go with this larger loan from Exim Bank. And so that meant that the $67 million of capital that was extended to Bethlehem Steel and to Ikomi in this partnership to start this manganese operation was essentially funded by US taxpayers coming out of the Treasury Department. And Bethlehem Steel at the same time was using its own private capital at $60 million to fund the opening of an iron ore mine in Venezuela. So because this is manganese and not iron ore, and manganese was categorized as a strategic mineral, whereas iron ore was not, they were able to get this special financing through the US government to start what was a private operation. And so this meant that the Office of Defense Materials Procurement also was able to support the production because through the 1950 Defense Materials Procurement Act, this Office of Defense Materials Procurement committed to purchasing 20% of the mine's output at a fixed rate, thus guaranteeing roughly a fifth of their market and making the investment less risky. So Bethlehem was able to get financing through the US government and a guaranteed market through the US government. The conditions of the Exim Bank loan did change the original terms agreed upon between Antunes and Bethlehem. The 20% reinvestment into regional development was abandoned for the period of which this loan was being paid off, and instead the royalty rate jumped from 4% to 5%. Furthermore, the explicit terms of the loan required that all exports from the mine go to the United States. And interestingly, the loan also stipulated that Bethlehem had technical control over the project, despite the fact that they held the minority shares in the company. This broke with the standard arrangement in which the majority controlling interest has ultimate say over the business decisions, making the relationship between Bethlehem and Ikomi one of convenience more than clearly communicating the ownership over the project. So when I mentioned this kind of new model of production in one of the really interesting policy papers written called Remedying the Present Grave Situation, Proposals for Competing for Our Metal Requirements from Abroad, which I found in the CIA archives, the author says, and explicitly names Bethlehem as this model, and says, because of the tendency toward nationalism, it is becoming more difficult in many countries for our mining companies to acquire, as in the past, full control of the properties they may wish to develop. It would therefore be advisable in acquiring properties to follow the example of Bethlehem in Brazil, and be willing to accept a minority interest in mining ventures abroad. The contract would stipulate that the major portion of the minerals produced be exported to the United States. The advantages of such cooperative agreements are that they free the American investor from attack by local politicians. There could be no question of American imperialism, and they would go a long way towards improvement of our political relations with the nations involved. So very clearly, this is a new strategy, and very clearly Bethlehem is at the heart of this new strategy. And so, This model was really so effective that when I traveled to Amapá this past spring, outside of really a few historians and people who worked higher up within Ikomi, no one had ever heard of Bethlehem steel. So everyone had heard of Ikomi, but no one had heard of Bethlehem steel, and the few that had, I learned, referred to it as Beshko. So I learned Bethlehem is very hard to say for folks in Brazil. So Beshko became the name that, again, only a handful of people had ever heard of. There were some interesting case studies done in this time period about foreign investment in the petroleum and mineral sector, and one of them that focuses on a case study analysis of Bethlehem in Brazil states, and I quote, "A conscious effort appears to have been made to play down Bethlehem's role in Ikomi in its public statements." So there was an intention to make sure that this really looked like a Brazilian firm and that the foreign interests in it were minimized. Okay, so this all provides context for the operations. Let's take a look at some of them. Okay, so 121 miles of track were laid through the jungle and crossing multiple rivers to connect the mine in Serra do Navio to the port in Santana. This was the third train built in the Amazon. So this is a huge project. And the loading and port facilities were constructed on the Amazon River, as seen behind me. The two towns were constructed, and the photo above is of the layout of the town at the mine site at Serra do Navio. So unlike the company towns built by Bethlehem and their mines in Chile and in Venezuela, this was actually the first company town in Latin America that wasn't designed in-house by Bethlehem engineers and architects. A soon-to-be famous architect, Brazilian architect by the name Osvaldo Arthur Bratsky, who later became part of the Sao Paulo modernist wave, actually designed Serra do Navio. And he designed it as a sort of standard three-tier company town. So according to actually the Bethlehem Review, which is 1979 magazine, spotlights Brazil and the operations there, Antunes, and this is a quote from the Bethlehem Review, Antunes insisted upon the employee comfort route. And so in this sense, they really wanted to engineer this town in the jungle to have a lot of modern services. And trained engineers were brought in to serve as administrative staff. So you can see these sort of three tiers. This is where the highest up management lived. This is where the next level administrative staff lived. And this is where the mine workers lived. So the trained engineers were largely brought to serve as administrative staff, and while some, but very few Americans lived permanently in Serra do Navio. However, almost all of the trained engineers and administrative staff did come from the southern part of Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and so they were outsiders who weren't accustomed to the humidity, the weather, the food, the accents of this northern Amazonian part of Brazil. And so the hierarchies that existed there, while they were different than some of the company towns in which American management was at the top, they were still highly racialized. So it was largely people with whiter skin who had come for more money who played these roles as management. And while I would love to go into lots of detail about daily life in Serra do Navio, there's so many things to say about it. I want to just say that organized sports were an important part of social life. So there's a lot of documented history about the role of organized sports and industrial capitalists and the ways in which industrial capitalists use sports as a way of building teamwork among workers with the aim of increasing productivity, as managing the leisure time of workers, and sometimes as trying to build linkages and relationships between management and workers through sports. So it's interesting because you can see baked into the design, here are the sports fields. It's sort of the intermediary space between workers and management, and that idea was very much built in and baked into the design of this town. So this is what the houses of mine laborers looked like. They were what we might call twins, as in one house had two separate homes, or one structure had two separate homes in it. And you can see that this is a photo that I took of one of the homes which has, I just took recently, which has been decently preserved and is now a post office in the town. In 1957, over 2,000 workers were employed by Ikomi. and that was roughly 1/5 of the total population of Amapá. So this was like the biggest, most serious, most capital-intensive industrial production in all of Amapá. And again, Bethlehem Steel was at the heart of it. These are photos of the junior administrators and senior administrators' houses, which were certainly much larger. They were single houses, and they all adopted some form of innovative architectural designs. So you'll note that they're all one level. This is better for the intense heat and humidity of this region. None of them had air conditioning, but a number of techniques were used to increase airflow and stay cool, including using these like really cool sort of cylinders of cement that helped to take the heat out and increase airflow, which I guess was an Arabic design used in parts of Portugal and then was adopted by Brachki. So a lot of the documentation of the town has been documented by Brachki's students because he later became a famous architect. And so many of his students have studied Serra do Navio, much more interested particularly in the architectural features of the town. So much of the work to increase airflow, stay cool, fight off mosquitoes and insects was important. In fact, Robert Butler, who was one of the original people from Bethlehem who went down to Brazil, later became president of ICOMI, and he was quoted in the Bethlehem Review saying, "We've created an oasis in the Serra do Navio wilds. We've changed everything. That is everything except the bugs." So clearly the bugs still played a role. I just want to note that these photos all come from albums which NMIH has and are actually sitting on the table right here, so feel free afterwards to look through them. And they contain images that various scholars and historians in Amapá have never seen before. I took some of these photos and brought them to Brazil, and many people were very excited about them. So I'm hoping that there's a possibility for a future collaborative digitization process in which maybe we can get a virtual exhibit with some of these images, and of course with both English and Portuguese translations. So if anyone in that audience wants to fund that and is really excited about it, absolutely let me know. Okay, so let's see. So the first round of workers that were recruited largely locally, but because the population of Amapá was so small, eventually people came from all over Brazil. This type of work, which is work that has wages, a steady paycheck, company-provided housing, access to imported goods, was basically entirely unheard of in the region before this operation was set up, especially for those who had little formal education. The company town had the very first supermarket in all of Amapá. It had a hospital with an operating room and maternity services with highly trained doctors. So in this sense, working for ICOMI was a status symbol, and it did breed some resentments with nearby communities who didn't have the same access to the services, and for whom entering these company towns, which were essentially private property, was highly policed. So I chose the picture of the maternity ward in part to remind ourselves, in addition to these mining operations and the movement of minerals, that hundreds, maybe even thousands of people were born in these company towns, and this was home to them. And so as we think about this, what does it mean when people are born in, raised in, live their whole lives in a town that is essentially private property, a part of these kind of productive enterprises? It breeds many fascinating contradictions, some of which I'll get into and others of which I won't, but feel free to ask about that in Q&A. So to mine from such a remote locale required building a whole social world, and in building that social world, Bethlehem Steel and ICOMI, in a sense, were not just planning for the mining operations, but were building the way in which people would live their lives and workers would live their lives. So interestingly, the administrative workers that I spoke to often talked about the extreme boredom and lack of culture in town, just being in the jungle and essentially being bored. But contrasting with that, many of the mine workers I spoke to expressed a sense of rich cultural lives, filled with dances, festivals, rituals, sports. And in the interviews that I conducted with current and former residents, many narrators recalled things like the fire hydrants, the reliable electricity, the running water, including hot running water, for the top management, a club with a swimming pool, good schools, sidewalks, and what was mentioned to me over and over again was the yellow school buses. Some people even insisted that life in Serra de Navio looked like the portrayal of life in the United States that they later saw on television, albeit Amazon style. So, of course, this bred many contradictions and complexities, but one of them was the fact that this existence and this life was always going to be finite. And this is the reality with extractive operations, is that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So while most of the talk focused on the beginning of the company town, production of the mine hit a peak output phase in the 1970s, just 20 years after Serra de Navio was built, and then it began a prolonged decline. Ikomi had just under 2,000 workers in 1957, and that number steadily decreased over the years. It then went up a bit between 1971 and 1975, back up to 1,400. And then after this, there was a steady decline, and by 1987, less than 1,000 workers remained, and layoffs intensified. While being laid off is hard enough, being laid off and working in a company town meant not only losing your job, but losing your housing as well. Losing your kids' school, and losing all of the privileges that came with working for Ikomi. So many of the narratives about life in Serra de Navio is also about what happened at the end when it closed. Okay, so let's just do a quick overview of the timeline of operations here. So the towns and the railroads were largely constructed around 1954. In 1956 is when the manganese exports actually began. And interestingly, because they were producing for a world market where there are prices that change, in 1957 that was the peak of the price of manganese. The shortage leading up to this time period had led to the price going up. And then after Bethlehem invested all this money, or really after US taxpayers had invested all this money, the price of manganese went down. So actually the most money ever made on the mine was in the very first year when prices were high. It never made more money than in that very first year. In 1962, the Exim Bank loan was paid in full, which meant that the conditions and terms of the agreement shifted. And the ways in which they shifted meant that no longer did the mine only have to export to the United States, and they began a process of reinvesting the 20% of what they produced into local production. In 1971, this is when manganese exports to Europe started to exceed those to the United States. And in this period between 73 and 83, there was a pellet feed plant in Santana that was operating, and there was also a ferromanganese plant a little bit after that. 1984 is the year that Bethlehem Steel sells its shares in Ikomi, and Ikomi prepares for its wind down. So I want to say a little story about this. First, it took me 5 years to find that date of when Bethlehem Steel pulled out. It was not very well publicized that was happening. And interestingly, it was in a period, again, in interviewing one of the former presidents of Ikomi, he said that Antunes, who was the head of the company at the time, sort of said to Bethlehem, listen, we're winding down this mine, it's gonna be ugly, it's gonna be hard and difficult, people are gonna lose their jobs. It'll be easier for all of us if it's a fully Brazilian company when this happens, and that it can't be blamed on a foreign corporation coming in, taking resources and leaving, so it will be convenient for us and better for you all if we can sort of protect you from that last phase. So what does Bethlehem do? They sell all of their shares in Ikomi in this time period, and then they actually continue their business partnership with Antunes, and they reinvest in another firm that they had also been involved with through Antunes, that's in Minas Gerais and starting to do iron mining. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So as this happens, the wind down continues of the company town. In 1990, Amapá officially becomes a state and is no longer a federal territory, the designation that it got in 1943. And by 1997, all of the mining operations in Serra de Navio are entirely shut down. So this table is important for a number of reasons. It is based on the work of Monteiro, and a really, probably the best article that exists about Ikomi's work in Brazil that's in English. And Monteiro tracks all of the exports and output from the mine from 1957 through 1997. So first, much of the narrative in Amapá about these operations is that all of it, every single ton of manganese went to the United States, and absolutely none of it was used by the Brazilian steel industry. So if you talk to people on the streets, that's largely what people think, is they're like, this was a mine, the people from the United States came, they took all of our mineral, and that's the whole story. So obviously this attests to the fact that that's not precisely true. That we can see in the early production when the Exim Bank loan stipulated that all exports must go to the US, most production did in fact go to the US. However, significant amounts also went to the Brazilian steel industry, which was also beginning in this time period. However, after 1962, when the loan had been repaid, and US stockpiles were full at that point because they'd been purchasing and stockpiling the mineral, as well as Europe and Japan became buyers of manganese. And in less than a decade, the consumption by Europe outpaced those from the United States. This is also when US Steel stops purchasing from Amapá because they had opened their new mine in Gabon. So by late 1978, which is when we know Bethlehem's decline became more imminent, you can see that the consumption in the US dropped even further. So that's in this time period, and here's this blue is North America, but it really does represent to the United States. And so in this period, really the mine starts producing much more for Europe and much less for the United States. Okay, but what this graph makes positively clear is that the manganese mine was not producing simply for Bethlehem's internal consumption. It was producing for the global market. And in a sense, in that way, for Bethlehem Steel's global competitors. So in the 40-year life of the mine, over 35 million tons of earth were exported. And according to Montero's estimates, double and maybe even triple that amount of earth was actually removed in order to export that high quality ore. So back to this idea of sort of upside down cities. So cities is upside down mines, mines is upside down cities. So this is an image of one of the mining sites at Serra do Navio taken in 2023. And then this is actually an image that's very famous of the capital in Brasilia, which was built in 1960 in the same time period in which Bethlehem Steel is exporting manganese from Amapá. Bethlehem Steel actually contributed the structural steel to the construction of Brasilia. And so 18,000 tons of structural steel, some that were produced right here in Bethlehem, others that were produced at the Pottstown plant, were built and fabricated and sent on ships from New York City down to Rio de Janeiro, and then I don't even know how they got them to Brasilia. I mean, this is like, I want to look into this, how you even do that. So it was pretty remarkable, but it really does show that we have this sort of celebrated history of Bethlehem Steel in Brazil, of the construction of the Congress building, which is what these twin towers represent, at the Capitol, the new Capitol built in 1960, but we often don't talk about the related history of mining and where raw materials came from in that process. So the fundamental debate that many Brazilian scholars have, because this case in Serra do Navio is very well studied. There are many books, some of which I brought today, that have been written by Brazilian scholars. And largely the questions that they're asking and what they're debating is whether Icomi brought sustained development to the Amazon or not. This is the question they have, and this is what they're arguing about. And whether the operations contributed to the regional economy or not. Some scholars look at questions of royalties, others look at labor conflicts, and so there's many different debates, but most of them agree that we can't equate economic circulation with sustained development. So in other words, while Amapá was clearly a key locale for global capitalism to circulate, the legacy and sustained impact to Amapá is much more complex to measure. The older generation of Icomi workers will defend the company to the death entirely and are quick to reminisce about the good old days in which life was simpler, there was enough to eat, there were extensive social lives that existed before TVs arrived to the mining town or in the port town, there was a dignity in the work, and there was a future for their children. And they see this as a golden period in the Amazon and in Amapá. The younger generation of residents have a much more critical view. They remember a lot of extensive rules and regulations in the town and the harsh hierarchies that ordered people's lives, sometimes creating really bizarre conflicts in families, like cousins who weren't allowed to go to their cousin's house because one father worked as a mine worker and the other father worked as an administrator. And so the kids weren't allowed to ride their bikes to each other's homes. Or stories of husbands and wives that had to travel in separate train cars because they worked for different ranks for the company. So there were various forms of segregation, and it was the younger generation that tends to really bring those up as problematic. Whereas much of the older generation sort of says, we liked this, we were all okay with this. One of the interviews like this that really stood out to me and I found really fascinating was talking with a former mine worker who described the company as mother, Ikomi as mai, as mother. And he described how beautifully maintained the homes were. He went on at length, and I'm not kidding because I actually recorded it so I can tell you this, for 5 minutes about the beautiful swimming pool. I mean, just describing in detail what the water looked like, how clean it was, how amazing it was. And after he went on for minutes saying how gorgeous it was, I asked him, just out of curiosity, did you ever swim there? And he said he didn't. In fact, his class of workers was even forbidden from entering the pool. So these kinds of contradictions really emerge when we're looking at company towns. So while Amapá is a sensible starting point for analyzing Bethlehem's involvement in Brazil, it doesn't end there. The stipulation about reinvestment in Amapá meant that profits made from exporting from the Amazon could not be fully repatriated to the United States, and they needed to be invested locally. So according to Montero, these reinvestments included, interestingly, the calculations of wages paid to workers, which made up nearly half of that reinvestment. So in other words, Bethlehem Steel and Ikomi said, well, we gave wages to workers, that's reinvestment, and therefore that counts. Of the rest of the reinvestment, went into starting new businesses, including a research institute, one of which funded the creation of this atlas, which is really fascinating, and so that was actually funded through one of these sort of subsidiary research operations. So as a result of this stipulation to reinvest, Bethlehem became a partial investor in nearly a dozen subsidiary companies throughout Brazil. These involved some agricultural operations that supported Ikomi's employees, so they raised chickens, they raised food that were consumed by the workers, but they also included large-scale export operations in timber, plywood, dende, many of which either at the beginning or eventually had foreign partners, and all of which were eventually sold to foreign multinational corporations, and some exist today and play a significant role in Amapá. So this document shows some financial information from 1983, the year before Bethlehem Steel sold its shares in Ikomi. This came from Art Zimmerman's papers, and who worked internationally around raw materials and mining for Bethlehem Steel. And so one of the things that this really points out, as you can see, by 1983, Ikomi was not bringing in nearly as much money as MBR down here, Minerações Brasileiras Reunidas, so that's MBR. So when I said that Bethlehem Steel invested in iron mining in Minas Gerais, it was through this subsidiary operation, which is located down here. So Bethlehem Steel had actually played a really key role in starting MBR. They had provided the initial $1 million of seed capital to start these operations. And this is a much longer and fascinating history about opening up a region of Brazil that has always been mineral rich. The state is actually called Good Mines, Minas Gerais. However, the infrastructure to get minerals from this far inland in the country over mountains to the coast for large-scale export had been lacking. And even though that kind of export had existed in, let's say, the 1920s, it was always insufficient. There were a lot of problems with the rail lines, and there was a sense that massive capital investment needed to happen in order to open up this part of Brazil to large-scale mining. Okay, so I'm going to be quick here because we're running out of time and I want to hear questions from you all. So basically what happens is that Bethlehem Steel invests in this in MBR, and when they sell their shares in Icomi, they move to where money is being made in Brazil in iron mining. And MBR is not only doing iron mining, they're also doing some steel production as well. So the irony is that in 1984, in the same time period in which Bethlehem is investing in the Brazilian iron mining and steel industry and making decent money on it, is also the first year that Bethlehem Steel brings Brazil to international trade court through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, claiming that unfair Brazilian subsidies were undercutting US steel production. So this is a pretty sort of fascinating and complex dynamic here, where Bethlehem Steel is both claiming this international trade court, but also making money off of the rise of the Brazilian steel industry. So they were actually invested, Bethlehem Steel was invested in MBR until its bankruptcy, until 2003, and then sold its shares to Vale, which is now one of the largest mining companies in the world, and which now owns all of the infrastructure of MBR. So let's just briefly say, what are the afterlives of this mining operation after it closed down? So you can see these images, and I took my now 6-year-old, but then 5-year-old to many of these places, and when we walked into this building, he said to me, "Mom, this looks like the steel stacks." And so in many ways, we see this sort of rust belt of the Amazon as this infrastructure is there and is not currently being used. And if we think that the decay happens here quickly, try a tropical rainforest that's extremely humid, right? So that's happening at a much faster rate. In 2013, the port structure that was built by Icomi actually collapsed into the Amazon River, killing 6 people. And so that was the way in which the port history came to an end, and the following year the train stopped running in 2014. There continues to be ongoing environmental studies, particularly due to the questions around arsenic around the ferromanganese plant in Santana. And so many of the questions around development and the impacts of the operations continue to be debated by Brazilian scholars. However, there's also this parallel universe where former workers get together and to have reunions, not dissimilar, and as you can see by the logo of Icomi, it also doesn't look so different than the logo of Bethlehem Steel. And so I was able to connect with many of the former workers who have these reunions and who come together to share their local histories. And I think one part of my work and my project is to really bring these local histories closer together in what we can think of more as a local transnational history. How are these local histories connected to one another? And there's a lot of possibilities, I think, about thinking about the company culture and how it translated into different forms of conflict between, quote unquote, the Bethlehem way and the Icomi way, as well as other ways of being, living, and working that we can explore more. So I hope NMIH and those of you who are interested might be able to collaborate in a project like that, but it's certainly clear that we can say Bethlehem Steel is definitely much more than a national company that's a part of a national history, and we have to expand our thinking about this. So what are my conclusions here? Okay, my preliminary conclusions about Serra de Navio specifically is really just that the formation of this specific mine has to be situated at the intersection of a series of national and transnational dynamics, and these include things like the US demand for strategic minerals and the financing and purchasing policies that came out of that, the rise of the Brazilian steel industry and the creation of an internal market for minerals and exports in Brazil, this ongoing project to quote-unquote conquer the Amazon rainforest and penetrate the interior of the country, something that has been a part of Brazil's history since colonization through developmentalism and various forms of nationalism. And that this also represents a kind of new business strategy of these joint ventures in the face of resource nationalism that I see as really collaboratively designed both by multinational corporations as well as an entrepreneurial elite in Brazil. I also see the kind of company towns as in utopian planning. Something I'm working with is this idea of capitalist communes as these company towns, motivated, yes, by efficient production, but also by this overt civilizing mission. And lastly, that there are changing market conditions and global trends in steel production that need to be considered as well. So how does this relate to Bethlehem Steel and Bethlehem Steel's history? So I think that for Bethlehem Steel, the company's involvement in Brazil needs to largely be understood as not only a search for minerals to satisfy production demands for the company, but as an illustrative example of an extended and profitable multinational partnership in global mining and steel production. And furthermore, Bethlehem Steel is really an essential case study for examining the history of US corporations that operated in the Amazon. So there's a lot of comparative work to be done there. So that's what I wanted to share with you all today. Thank you so much for being patient through this long presentation, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you.
Any questions?
How did the size of this operation compare with Bethlehem Steel's overall outside the U.S. operations?
Okay, so I can compare it to other operations in Latin America, and there was a similar amount of workers early on for the construction. It's the best comparative case is really with Venezuela because they happened at the same time and in a similar climate. And so they also had sort of around 2,000 workers. I will say that the iron ore mines were producing far more than the manganese mines. So there were, in Venezuela, periods in which they were outputting 4 million tons a year of manganese, of iron ore. And in Brazil, for example, the output was just a little bit over 1 million tons a year. So the operations in Venezuela were producing far more, as well as in Chile. So in terms of workforce, some parallels, but in terms of output, less manganese was being produced. And then if we compare it to the case in Mexico, which I didn't give an example of, but was also a joint venture in manganese mining, that was shaft tunnel mining. So they were producing far less than these kinds of open pit mines. Yeah.
What is the industry like today in Amapá? What's going on there now since the mining left?
Yeah, so a number of the companies that were created through the partnership around reinvestment still exist today. And so there's a lot of plywood exports that are happening out of the port, and really the whole infrastructure that was built by Bethlehem and through ECOMI really set the foundation for the sort of arteries of export and relationship with global markets. And so in that sense, many of these operations still exist. There's now a sort of like medium scale acai, which is a berry from the Amazon export operation there, but the plywood is the biggest and it still exists, but was sold to a foreign corporation. And interestingly, at Serra de Navio, a lot of the lower grade manganese rejected ore piles still exist today, and there's a US corporation that is currently exporting that. So they don't have a license to mine, but they do now own all the infrastructure around the mine, and they are sending it on trucks down dirt roads in the Amazon because the train no longer exists. Now this is a pretty sort of low market value good because it's low grade manganese, so it's all being shipped to China where it's being processed and used in the Chinese steel industry. And so far when I spoke with them, 3 boatloads had gone. So it's a kind of slow process of moving low grade ore on trucks. Yeah.
Well, what was the percentage of manganese in the ore mined here?
It ranged, but I think it went as high as 56%, but 53 were more of the studies. So it needs to be a lower percentage than iron ore to be considered high grade. So high grade iron ore is upwards of 60%, but high grade manganese ore can be around 51%. Yeah.
Did Bethlehem Steel use this model elsewhere globally and fail?
Yeah, great question. Yes and no. So they had a similar model of the minority ownership with their business partner, Enrique Madero Braco, who is in Mexico. The mining operations in Mexico were not as prolific, in part because they were doing shaft tunnel mining. And they became depleted. They overestimated really how much ore was there. And so that seemed like an operation that was where Bethlehem has always, in like all the documentation, said that they were very pleased with their relationship with Antunes in Brazil, that it was a great investment, it was a long, partnership. It seemed like their operations in Mexico were a little bit more complicated, where they were sort of moving to chase manganese with this business partner they had. So that was less successful in that sense, and they got out of Mexico earlier. The other sort of counter is that why they created these partnerships is because of the risk of nationalization, which was not just theoretical for Bethlehem Steel, but their properties had been nationalized in Cuba in 1961, so that's after starting the operation in Brazil, in Chile in 1971, and in Venezuela in 1975. So all of the wholly owned iron ore mining operations in Latin America were ultimately nationalized by those governments.
Follow-up question. Bethlehem Steel obviously had a lot of smart people that worked there. Was there anybody who had a title of business historian that looked at a lot of these things and said, you know what, hey, we can't do this, or we should do this because the environment, the culture would allow it? Was there anybody like that? Because they had a lot of smart people who worked there.
Sure, yes. I mean, one of the things about researching Bethlehem Steel that's so challenging is that the kind of like high-level internal conversations, conflicts, and disputes, if anyone knows where those are documented, please do let me know. But as far as I have found, there isn't much documentation of them, right? So we have, board meeting minutes where everyone agreed this is what we're doing, no conversation and no disagreement. So it's hard to know that. I can say, though, that certainly Latin America became a politically risky place to invest. And that was clear, and Bethlehem Steel was clear about that. But they also had invested so much. So they were kind of like, how much earth can we move as quickly as possible before we have to sort of wake up and face the changing political climates? So they continued their operations. And one of the ways, in addition to these joint partnerships, that they adjusted their own practices were also to stop bringing in American management. So over time, national engineers were trained to play those administrative roles, and that was largely after the 1950s where that shift happened in Latin America. But even prior to the nationalization in Cuba following the Cuban Revolution, Bethlehem Steel had also, it kind of seemed like a little bit of a shady deal, but had like hidden their investments in iron ore properties in Mexico that were ultimately nationalized in the 1930s. So they had experience with this even 3 decades before their other nationalizations, and it was on their radar. And more than necessarily a business historian counseling them, the decision to go to Canada was really coming from this. So even though labor costs were higher in Canada, and you had to contend with winter, which meant that there were large periods of time in which ore couldn't be moved because of winter, which is another reason that Latin America was so attractive. It was seen as a politically safer investment. So a lot of the sort of move towards getting minerals from Canada was based on that political assessment. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was this governmental focus on resources restricted to manganese? I mean, we use lots of other stuff. It's critical.
Big question.
Yeah, it wasn't restricted to manganese, and here's a really fun one, y'all. So nickel and chrome were also a focus of investment in this time period, and in fact, Bethlehem Steel put in a proposal to manage and run a nickel mine and nickel production facility in Cuba in the 1950s, specifically because of the larger politics and ability to get financing. They were turned down, and the proposal was given to Freeport Sulphur, and that became the really famous Nicaro plant that was ultimately taken by the Cuban government after the most US investment in a foreign country in history. And so Bethlehem Steel kind of dodged a bullet on that one, but they were interested in paying attention to nickel and chrome were the other two main ones. Yeah.
So the loans that were given to the companies, were these loans at the joint venture subsidiary level, or were they held by the parent company, Bethlehem Steel? And if they defaulted, what happened? Would those assets technically come back to the American company, or would it be stuck in the country?
Yeah, so it was officially the joint company, ICOMI, was the recipient.
But what was interesting is that written into the loan agreement was kind of like, even though Bethlehem Steel is 49% owner, we're kind of really like, we're lending this to Bethlehem Steel, and we want them to be responsible for paying us back and them to be responsible for the technical components, and that's why the money is being lent. So it was all sort of clear that Bethlehem Steel was on the hook. Yeah.
Does the company, Brazil still export as much as they did before? And if not, where does it come from?
The manganese today,
Yeah.
you're asking about. You know, Brazil is still exporting manganese, and one of the things that's changed in the United States is that the move away from integrated steel production, in which all the raw materials are incorporated, and towards mini mills or using much more recycled steel, is that less manganese is also required because the manganese is already in the steel. So using recycled steel has also decreased the need to import large amounts of manganese. So there's a variety of sources right now, and Brazil, I do believe, is still an exporter of manganese, but China, for example, which has integrated steel mills, is purchasing a lot of raw materials, whereas the US is purchasing less in its steel production. Yeah.
Did the Bethlehem Steel have any communication with Hershey Chocolate, another huge company that had a very similar problem with sugar and sugarcane production in Cuba?
Yeah, they did. I mean, interestingly, we think of sugar and like American capital in the sugar industry, but actually Bethlehem Steel predated them. And so Bethlehem Steel and mining in eastern Cuba by U.S. corporations, Bethlehem Steel really led the way. U.S. sugar interests didn't really take hold in Cuba until after independence, and then the U.S. occupation of Cuba. And that's when U.S. capital was really invited to invest in Cuba more heavily. And Bethlehem Steel, as well as the Spanish-American mining company, which was a part of Pennsylvania Steel at the time, and then Bethlehem ultimately purchased that and became a sort of monopoly owner of iron mining in Cuba. They were early investors, and the ways in which they collaborated, that was my theory at first, that Bethlehem Steel must have learned how to be a transnational corporation from the sugar companies there. And the time periods are actually wrong, that maybe it's the reverse. And so Bethlehem Steel had certainly set up quite a bit of infrastructure to figure out how to have these kind of transnational operations. The collaborations came a little bit later, in the 1910s, 1920s, when U.S. corporations in Cuba collaborated on setting up a series of schools in Cuba to try to train Cuban workers to become better Christian workers. And Bethlehem Steel was very involved in boards, and they were involved in that process, collaborating with U.S. sugar interests. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'm curious if in any of your research you come across any documentation of what occurred for the indigenous population in that area?
Yeah, very little, right? Which says a lot. So I would say one of the things that's sort of interesting about Bethlehem Steel's setup in Serra de Navio was this was just like an outpost in a way where that became a jumping off point for a lot of research. So some of what I've learned about Serra de Navio comes from entomologists, that's those studying insects, as well as anthropologists who are making contact with indigenous communities and using Bethlehem Steel's base in the Amazon as the sort of jumping off point for their research or to enter the jungle. And there was specifically a community, the Waiwai, deep in the Amazon who are classified in Brazil as a quote unquote uncontacted tribe that had been thought to have all been killed or died. Who were sort of refound in the 1970s, and it was Bethlehem Steel's mining camp that was the base for anthropologists and the Brazilian state that was doing sort of that connection. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for your time and attention, and I hope to get to chat with you all more. Thank you.